The dog who waited. The first time Thomas saw the dog, it was raining. Not the gentle kind of rain that whispers against window panes and makes the world feel cozy and safe, but the harsh, unforgiving kind that drives needles of cold water into your skin and turns the streets into rivers of grey. Thomas had just left the hospital, St. Mary's, the one on 14th Street, and he was walking with his head down, collar turned up against the downpour, when he noticed the shape huddled beneath the bus stop shelter. At first, he thought it was a pile of rags or an abandoned bag. The city was full of forgotten things. But as he drew closer, shielding his eyes from the rain, he saw the subtle rise and fall of breathing, the unmistakable curve of a living spine. A dog, medium-sized, with matted brown and white fur that clung to its ribs like wet paper. It sat perfectly still, facing the street, as if waiting for something or someone. Thomas slowed his pace. He'd always liked dogs, though he'd never owned one himself. His late wife, Margaret, had been allergic. They'd talked about getting one after her treatments were finished, after she was better. But she never got better. The dog didn't turn to look at him as he approached. Its dark eyes remained fixed on the empty road, watching the occasional car splash past through puddles that reflected the yellow glow of streetlights. There was something haunting about its stillness, its unwavering attention. Thomas found himself stopping completely, standing just a few feet away. "Hey there," he said softly. His voice felt strange in his throat. He hadn't spoken to anyone since leaving the hospital 3 hours ago, since the doctor had told him there was nothing more they could do, that Margaret's room was being cleaned, that he should take care of himself. Take care of himself. As if he knew how to do that anymore. As if the past 42 years hadn't been entirely about taking care of her, about being half of a whole that no longer existed. The dog's ear twitched, a small acknowledgement, but it didn't break its vigil. Thomas looked around. It was nearly midnight. The rain showed no signs of stopping. The street was empty except for the occasional taxi rushing past, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. The storefronts were dark, their windows reflecting nothing but the rain and the streetlights, and Thomas's own hollow-eyed reflection. "Waiting for someone?" he asked, feeling foolish for talking to an animal, but somehow needing to break the silence that had been suffocating him all day. The silence of Margaret's hospital room after the machines had been turned off. The silence of the hallway as he'd walked out for the last time. The silence of his car on the drive that he couldn't even remember taking. No collar, no tags. The dog was clearly a stray, or worse, abandoned. Thomas knew he should keep walking. He had his own grief to carry, his own empty apartment to return to, his own impossible tomorrow to face. He didn't have the energy to take on someone else's pain, even a dog's, but he couldn't move. There was something in the way the dog waited, patient, faithful, unquestioning, that touched something deep inside him. It reminded him of Margaret in her final days, the way she'd waited for him to arrive each morning at the hospital, her face lighting up the moment he walked through the door, as if he were the only thing in the world worth waiting for. Even when the pain was unbearable, even when the morphine made her confused and disoriented, she'd known him. She'd waited for him. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the dog or to his wife or to himself. Then he pulled his jacket tighter and continued down the street, his shoes squelching against the wet pavement, leaving the waiting dog behind. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. That night, lying in the bed that felt impossibly large without Margaret beside him, Thomas stared at the ceiling and saw those dark, patient eyes. He thought about the rain, about the cold, about what it meant to wait for something that might never come. The bedroom still smelled like her, lavender and vanilla, the lotion she'd used every night before bed. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand, folded carefully beside the novel she'd never finish. Her pillow still held the faint impression of her head. At 3 a.m, he got up, made himself a cup of tea he didn't drink, and watched the steam curl and disappear into the darkness of his kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. The clock on the wall ticked. The world continued turning as if nothing had changed, as if the most important person in his universe hadn't just blinked out of existence. Thomas thought about the dog again, wondered if it was still there, still waiting in the rain, wondered what kind of loyalty, what kind of love could make a creature sit in the cold and dark and wait with such absolute faith. He'd been loyal to Margaret, hadn't he? He'd been there every single day of her illness, every treatment, every setback, every small victory and crushing defeat. But his loyalty had come with the understanding that she was there, that she knew him, that they were together, even in the worst moments. What the dog had seemed different, purer somehow, more complete. It waited not because someone was there, but because someone should be there, because it believed they would return. That kind of faith seemed almost holy. When dawn finally broke, grey and reluctant, Thomas made a decision. He filled a container with water and another with leftover chicken from the fridge, food he'd made for Margaret 3 days ago, when they'd still had hope, when the doctors had still been talking about possibilities instead of inevitabilities. She'd never eaten it. He couldn't bring himself to eat it either, but maybe it could serve a purpose now. Maybe something good could come from it. Thomas drove back to 14th Street, his hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, his heart doing strange things in his chest. Part of him expected the dog to be gone, moved on, or taken by animal control, or worse. Part of him needed the dog to be gone, because if it was still there, still waiting after a night like that, it would mean something. Thomas wasn't sure he was ready to confront. But as he pulled up to the bus stop, his breath catching in his throat, he saw it. Still there, still waiting. The rain had stopped, but the dog was soaked through, its fur plastered against its thin frame. It sat in exactly the same position, facing the same direction, as if it hadn't moved a single inch in the 8 hours since Thomas had last seen it. Puddles surrounded it, reflecting the weak morning light. Its body was trembling, from cold or exhaustion or both, but its gaze remained fixed on the street with an intensity that was almost frightening. Thomas got out of his car slowly, not wanting to startle the animal. He approached with the food and water extended like an offering, like a prayer to a God he wasn't sure was listening anymore. "Hey, buddy," he said, his voice gentler than he remembered it being. Gentler than it had been in months, maybe. Margaret had always brought out the softness in him, the tenderness he kept hidden from the rest of the world. Without her, he'd felt himself hardening, closing off. But something about this dog made him want to try. "I brought you something." This time the dog turned to look at him. Its eyes were deep brown, flecked with amber, and so profoundly sad that Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, two creatures acquainted with loss, with waiting, with the weight of absence. Thomas saw his own grief reflected back at him in those eyes, and he wondered if the dog saw the same in his. Thomas set the containers down a few feet from the dog and stepped back. He watched as the animal slowly, almost reluctantly, stood up. Its movements were stiff, painful. How long had it been sitting there? Days? Weeks? Its legs seemed uncertain beneath it, and Thomas could count its ribs even through the wet fur. The dog approached the food cautiously, sniffed it once, then looked back at the street, at the spot it had been watching. The conflict was visible in every line of its body. Hunger versus loyalty, survival versus hope. Thomas understood that conflict. He'd felt it every time he'd left Margaret's hospital room to eat or sleep or attend to some necessary task. The guilt of choosing your own needs over your devotion to someone else. "It's okay," Thomas said, surprised by how much he meant it. "You can eat. You can keep waiting after. I promise you can come right back to this spot and wait as long as you need to." As if it understood, the dog turned to the food and began to eat, delicately at first, then with increasing desperation. It ate like it hadn't had a meal in days, which it probably hadn't. It drank all the water in great gulping swallows, then licked the container clean. When it was finished, it looked at Thomas with something that might have been gratitude, then returned immediately to its post, sat down with a small grunt of effort, and resumed its vigil. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "Who are you waiting for?" he asked, his voice breaking. Who loved you enough to make you believe like this?" The dog, of course, didn't answer, but in the silence Thomas heard his own question echo back at him. Who had he been waiting for all those months in the hospital? Margaret had been right there, but she'd also been slipping away day by day, becoming someone he almost didn't recognize. Had he been waiting for her to come back, for the woman he'd married to return from behind the veil of illness and pain? Had he been keeping vigil for someone who was already gone? Thomas went home, but he came back that afternoon, and the next morning, and the evening after that. Each time he brought food and water, sometimes chicken, sometimes beef, sometimes high-quality dog food he bought from the pet store 3 blocks from his apartment. Each time, the dog accepted his offerings with the same cautious gratitude, eating quickly but not desperately anymore, then returning to waiting. It never tried to follow him. It never begged or whined or sought affection beyond a brief acknowledgement of his presence. It simply waited with a patience that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. After a week, Thomas started staying longer. He'd sit on the bench at the bus stop a few feet from the dog and just be. At first he didn't talk. He just watched the world go by. The buses that came and went, the people who rushed past without seeing the faithful creature among them, the changing light as day turned to evening turned to night. It was peaceful in a way nothing else had been since Margaret died. No one expected anything from him here. No one offered condolences he didn't know how to accept, or asked how he was doing when the only honest answer was, "Terribly." It was just him and the dog, and the quiet understanding between them. Eventually he started talking. About Margaret, mostly. About how they'd met at a bookstore 43 years ago, both reaching for the same worn copy of East of Eden. About the way she'd laughed when their hands touched, a sound like wind chimes and summer rain. About their first date at a tiny Italian restaurant that had since closed down, where they'd talked for 6 hours straight and hadn't noticed the staff waiting for them to leave. About their wedding in the rain, a downpour not unlike the one that had led Thomas to this dog, and how Margaret had said it was good luck, that rain on your wedding day meant your marriage would weather any storm. She was wrong about that, Thomas said one evening, watching the sun set behind the buildings across the street, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Margaret would have loved. Or maybe she was right, and we just ran out of time. 42 years. It sounds like a lot, doesn't it? But it wasn't enough. It will never be enough. The dog's ear twitched, that small sign that it was listening. Thomas talked about the cancer, how they'd found it during a routine checkup, how it had already spread by then, how the word stage 4 had felt like a death sentence even though the doctors had talked about treatment options and hope. He talked about the chemotherapy that had stolen Margaret's beautiful silver hair, the radiation that had left her skin raw and painful, the experimental treatments that had given them brief moments of hope before reality came crashing back in. She was so brave, Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. So much braver than me. Even at the end, when she knew, when we both knew, she was trying to take care of me, telling me I'd be okay, that I'd find joy again, that I had to promise to keep living after she was gone. He laughed, a bitter sound. I lied to her, I promised, but I was lying. How am I supposed to keep living when half of me is gone? The dog turned to look at him then, really look at him, and Thomas felt seen in a way he hadn't since Margaret died. It was strange, finding comfort in a stray dog's eyes, but grief made everything strange. Nothing made sense anymore anyway. The world had become a foreign country, where he didn't speak the language or understand the customs, where every familiar landmark reminded him only of what he'd lost. "Who are you waiting for?" Thomas asked again, softer this time. "What happened to them? Did they die too? Or did they leave you behind? Did they have a choice, or did the universe just take them away like it took Margaret from me?" The dog turned back to the street, and Thomas followed its gaze. He tried to imagine the story. A beloved owner who'd gotten on a bus and never returned. Someone who died suddenly, leaving this faithful creature behind without explanation. An accident, perhaps, or an illness like Margaret's, or just the casual cruelty of abandonment. Maybe someone had moved away and couldn't take their dog. Maybe someone had gotten sick and there was no one else to care for their beloved pet. Maybe someone had simply stopped loving this creature that still loved them with such desperate intensity. Whatever the truth was, it didn't matter. The dog waited with the kind of faith that made Thomas's heart ache. It believed in return. It believed in reunion. Even after everything, the hunger, the cold, the endless disappointments of buses that came and went without bringing its person back, it still believed. Thomas wished he could believe in something too. He wished he could have faith that Margaret was somewhere waiting for him, that death wasn't just an ending, but a transition, that they would be together again someday. But he'd never been particularly religious, and grief had stripped away even the small comfort of uncertainty. When the priest had spoken at Margaret's funeral about heaven and eternal rest and reunions in the afterlife, Thomas had felt only a hollow ache where hope should have been. But this dog had faith. This dog still believed. And somehow, sitting beside this waiting creature, Thomas felt a little less alone. 2 weeks became 3, then 4. The leaves on the trees began to change color, shifting from green to gold to red. The air grew crisp, and Thomas started bringing extra blankets when he visited. Thomas's visits became routine, became necessary, became the only thing that gave structure to his days. He'd wake up, make coffee he barely tasted, and drive to 14th Street. He'd sit with the dog for an hour or 2 or 3, talking or silent, depending on what he needed that day. Then he'd go home, eat something because he knew he should, and count the hours until he could return. He started to look forward to these visits, to the quiet companionship of the waiting dog. He began to notice small details, the way its tail would do a tiny, almost imperceptible wag when it saw Thomas approaching, the way it would lean, just slightly, toward his hand when he sat down, the way its breathing would slow and deepen when he spoke, as if his voice brought some measure of peace, the way it would sometimes rest its head on its paws, still watching the street, but allowing itself a moment of rest when Thomas was there. He named the dog Keeper, not because it kept watch, though it did, but because it had kept something alive in Thomas that he thought had died with Margaret. A sense of purpose, a reason to get up in the morning, someone to care for, even if that someone didn't seem to need or want much caring. It was a fragile thing, this purpose, but it was something. On the days when Thomas woke up and couldn't remember why he should get out of bed, he thought of Keeper waiting at the bus stop, and he got up. "You're keeping me going, buddy," Thomas said one afternoon, scratching behind Keeper's ears, a gesture the dog now permitted, though it never broke its watch. The fur was soft under his fingers, softer now that Keeper was eating regularly and the matted patches had smoothed out. "I hope you know that. I don't know if I'd still be here without you." It was true. In the first days after Margaret's death, Thomas had thought about ending it. Not seriously, not with any real plan, but the thoughts had been there. What was the point of continuing? What did he have to live for? Their children were grown and lived across the country, busy with their own families, their own lives. His career was behind him. He'd retired early to care for Margaret in her final months. His friends had mostly drifted away during the long years of illness, unable to cope with the relentlessness of it, the way every conversation circled back to cancer and treatments and hope and despair. But Keeper needed him. This dog, this faithful creature, needed someone to bring food and water and companionship. And strangely, Thomas needed to be needed. It gave him a reason to wake up, to dress, to leave the apartment that felt like a mausoleum. It gave him something to think about besides his own grief, his own crushing loss. Winter came, bitter and cruel. The temperature dropped, and snow began to fall in intermittent bursts. Thomas brought blankets, then more blankets, building a small shelter using cardboard boxes and plastic sheeting that he attached to the bus stop structure. He brought a heating pad that plugged into a solar battery, worried constantly that Keeper would be too cold, too exposed. The dog accepted these offerings with the same patient gratitude, but never used them unless Thomas was there. The moment Thomas left, Keeper would return to its vigil, sitting exposed to the elements in its chosen spot. Thomas tried, on several occasions, to coax Keeper into his car, to take the dog home, where it would be warm and safe and cared for properly. He'd open the passenger door, pat the seat, offer treats and encouragement, but Keeper wouldn't budge. The moment Thomas tried to lead it away from the bus stop, the dog would plant its feet and pull back, panic flashing in its eyes, a low whine emerging from its throat. Okay, Thomas would say, backing off immediately, his heart breaking a little more. I understand. You can't leave. Not yet. You have to be here when they come back. I get it. And he did get it. If there had been even the slightest chance that Margaret could return, wouldn't he wait forever? Wouldn't he sit in the cold and the dark and the endless disappointment, if there was even a fraction of a possibility that she would walk through the door one more time? So instead, Thomas sat with Keeper in the cold. He brought a thermos of hot coffee for himself and warm broth for the dog, which Keeper lapped up gratefully before returning to watch. They waited together, watching the street, watching the seasons change, watching life continue around them in all its ordinary glory. Thomas found a strange comfort in this shared vigil. He wasn't waiting for anything specific. Margaret wasn't coming back, but he was waiting nonetheless. For what, he couldn't say. For the pain to lessen, perhaps. For some sign that life could be worth living again. For meaning to emerge from the senselessness of loss. Other people noticed them. The bus stop regulars began to recognize Thomas, nodding to him as they came and went. Some would ask about the dog, and Thomas would tell them Keeper was waiting for someone. He'd tell them the story as he understood it, or at least the story he'd imagined, a faithful companion separated from its person, keeping vigil until they returned. How long? They'd ask, and there was always a note of sadness in the question, a recognition that this wait might be futile, that the person might never come. As long as it takes, Thomas would answer, and he meant it. One woman, an elderly lady with kind eyes and a thick accent Thomas couldn't quite place, Eastern European maybe, or Russian, started bringing treats for Keeper. Homemade biscuits that smelled of meat and spices, which Keeper accepted delicately from her wrinkled hands. She'd settle onto the bench beside Thomas, moving slowly, carefully, as if her bones were fragile things that might break under too much strain. My husband, he wait for me once, she said one cold afternoon, her breath misting in the air. 6 years during the war. Everyone tell him I'm dead, that I perish in the camps, that he should move on, find new wife. But he wait, and I come back. She smiled at Keeper, her eyes distant with memory, seeing something beyond the present moment. I am nothing when I return, sick, broken, not even recognize myself. But he know me, he wait, and he know me, and he love me still. She reached out and stroked Keeper's head with a tenderness that made Thomas's throat tight. 47 years we have together after that. 47 years because he have faith, because he wait. She turned to Thomas then, and her eyes were sharp despite their film of age. Faith is not stupid, you know. Sometimes is all we have. Sometimes is everything. Thomas thought about that a lot in the weeks that followed. Faith. He'd lost his own when Margaret died, when all the prayers and hope and desperate bargaining with a God he wasn't sure he believed in came to nothing. He'd prayed every single day of her illness. Please let the treatment work. Please let the cancer shrink. Please give us more time, just a little more time. But every prayer had gone unanswered, and eventually he'd stopped praying at all. What was the point? The universe was indifferent to human suffering. Faith was just a way of setting yourself up for disappointment. But Keeper still had faith. Keeper still believed. And the old woman had had faith too once upon a time. Her husband had waited 6 years on nothing but faith, and it had been rewarded. Maybe that was the thing about faith. It didn't guarantee outcomes, but it kept you going when nothing else could. It gave you a reason to keep breathing, keep trying, keep hoping, even when hope seemed like the stupidest thing in the world. Maybe that was enough. Maybe borrowed faith could sustain you until you found your own again. Spring arrived, tentatively, like it wasn't sure it was welcome. The snow melted into slush, then into puddles that reflected a pale blue sky. Crocuses pushed up through the hard ground near the bus stop, small explosions of purple and white that seemed almost defiant in their beauty. Margaret would have loved them. She'd always planted crocuses in their garden, saying they were proof that life persisted even after the longest, darkest winters. Thomas was sitting with Keeper on a Tuesday afternoon. He'd retired from his job at the accounting firm 2 months ago, unable to concentrate, unwilling to pretend anymore that he was okay, that he could focus on spreadsheets and tax codes when his entire world had collapsed, when a young woman approached the bus stop. She was probably in her mid-20s, wearing faded jeans and a yellow raincoat despite the clear weather, as if she expected rain at any moment. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she carried a worn backpack over one shoulder, the kind that looked like it had traveled many miles. She looked tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that came from traveling a long distance, from carrying burdens too heavy for one person to bear. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, as if she'd been crying recently. Thomas didn't pay her much attention at first. People came and went from the bus stop constantly. It was one of the busiest in the city, servicing 3 different lines that went to various parts of town. But then he noticed that she'd stopped moving. She'd frozen in place about 10 feet from the bench, staring at Keeper with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Shock, maybe, or disbelief, or something deeper and more complicated. Her hand had come up to cover her mouth, and her eyes were filling with tears. Keeper, for the first time in months, stood up. Thomas's heart stuttered in his chest. In all the time he'd been visiting, Keeper had never broken its vigil for anyone. The dog would turn its head to acknowledge Thomas, would accept food and water and the occasional ear scratch, but it never abandoned its post, never showed interest in anyone passing by. But now Keeper was standing and its entire body was trembling. Its tail, which Thomas had only ever seen move in small, controlled wags, was sweeping back and forth like a metronome set to joy, moving so fast it was almost a blur. A sound emerged from Keeper's throat, not a bark, but something closer to a cry, a keening note of recognition and longing and desperate hope that made every hair on Thomas's body stand on end. The young woman dropped her backpack. It hit the ground with a heavy thud, and she didn't even seem to notice. "Max," she whispered, her voice breaking on the syllable, barely audible over the sounds of traffic. "Max, is that really you?" And then she was running, and Keeper, Max, was running too, and they met in the middle of the sidewalk in a collision of love that made Thomas's throat close up completely. The woman fell to her knees, not seeming to care about the wet pavement or the people who had to walk around her, and Max was all over her, licking her face, pressing against her, making sounds Thomas had never heard before, whimpers and whines and yelps of pure, unbridled happiness. His whole body was shaking, not with cold or fear, but with joy so intense it seemed to vibrate through him. Oh my God, the woman was saying over and over, crying openly now, her arms wrapped around Max's neck, her face buried in his fur. "I looked everywhere for you, everywhere. I searched for months. I put up flyers. I called every shelter within 100 miles. I walked these streets until my feet bled. They told me you were gone, that someone had taken you, that I'd never find you again. But I couldn't give up. I had to come back. I had to see. I promised I'd come back." Max was making a sound deep in his chest, almost like purring but different, deeper, a sound of contentment and relief and love so profound it made Thomas's eyes burn with tears. The dog was pressing against the woman, as if trying to merge with her, as if trying to make sure she was real and solid and truly there. Thomas felt like he was intruding on something sacred. He started to stand, to give them privacy, to slip away and let them have this moment without an audience. But the woman looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her eyes shining with gratitude and wonder and disbelief. "Was it you?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Have you been taking care of him all this time? Was it you?" Thomas's voice came out rough, broken. He cleared his throat, tried again. I just brought food, water. He's been waiting here. I don't know for how long, but he's been waiting. I couldn't just leave him here alone." The woman looked down at Max, her hands running over his body, checking him, reassuring herself that he was real and whole and truly there. She was checking for injuries, Thomas realized, running her fingers over his ribs, which were no longer quite so visible thanks to the months of regular feeding, examining his paws, looking into his eyes with the practiced concern of someone who loved this dog more than words could express. 8 months, she said quietly, wonder and pain mixing in her voice. "It's been 8 months since I last saw him." 8 months. Thomas's breath caught. Keeper, Max, had been waiting for 8 months. Through summer heat and autumn cold and brutal winter and the early days of spring, Max had sat at this bus stop and waited with a faith that Thomas could barely comprehend. 8 months of every bus that wasn't the right one, every person who wasn't the one he was waiting for, every day that ended without reunion. And still he had believed. Still he had waited. The woman sat back on her heels. Max pressed against her side like he was trying to merge with her, like he would never let her out of his sight again, and told Thomas the story. Her name was Sarah Chen. She'd been a graduate student at the university, working on her master's thesis in environmental science, living in a small apartment 2 blocks from the bus stop. Max had been her constant companion since she'd adopted him as a puppy 5 years ago, finding him at a shelter where he'd been surrendered by owners who didn't want him anymore. They'd done everything together, walked the same routes through the city, shared the same routines, created a life that was small but complete. Max had been with her through undergraduate finals, through her first heartbreak, through the death of her grandmother, through every significant moment of her adult life. Then Sarah's father had gotten sick. Cancer, aggressive and fast-moving, the same word that had destroyed Thomas's world. Sarah had to leave immediately, flying back to Oregon to be with her family. It was supposed to be temporary, just a week, maybe 2, just until the doctors had a better handle on the prognosis. She'd left Max with her roommate Emma, a friend she'd trusted completely. Emma loved Max almost as much as Sarah did. It should have been fine. But her father's condition deteriorated rapidly. A week became 2, became a month, became 3. Sarah had tried desperately to arrange for Max to be sent to her, to have him flown out to Oregon, but her father was in and out of the hospital constantly. They were staying in different places. Nothing was stable enough. And every time she tried to make arrangements, another crisis would hit. Her father would take a turn for the worse, or there would be complications, or the doctors would try a new treatment that required her father to be in isolation. And then, 6 weeks after she'd left, Emma had called with devastating news. Max had gotten out. There'd been a furniture delivery to the apartment, and in the confusion of moving a new couch through the door, Max had bolted. Emma had been watching him, had just turned away for a second, and he was gone. They'd searched immediately, Emma and her boyfriend and Sarah's other friends, combing the neighborhood for hours, calling his name until their voices were hoarse. They'd posted flyers everywhere, called every shelter, every vet clinic, every animal control facility in the city. They'd set up a Facebook page and a lost pet website and offered a reward. But Max had vanished. "I was destroyed," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper, one hand still buried in Max's fur, as if she'd never let go. "My dad was dying and I'd lost Max, and I felt like my whole world was falling apart. I couldn't function, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. I felt like the universe was punishing me for leaving, for choosing my father over my dog, even though I didn't have a choice, even though Max would have wanted me to take care of my dad." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her cheek. "My dad, even at the end, even when he could barely speak, he told me not to give up. He said Max was smart, said he'd find his way home, that I just had to have faith. He made me promise that after he was gone, I'd come back and look for Max, that I wouldn't stop looking until I found him or until I knew for sure." She couldn't finish that sentence, couldn't voice the possibility that Max might have died, might have suffered, might have needed her and she hadn't been there. Thomas's breath caught. "Did you tell him to wait?" Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, cutting tracks through the dirt. "The morning I left, I brought him here to the bus stop. I was catching the 6 a.m. bus to the airport, and I couldn't bear the thought of saying goodbye at home, couldn't stand the idea of walking out the door and leaving him behind. So I brought him with me. Emma was supposed to pick him up here after I left. I held him right there." She pointed to the exact spot where Max had kept his vigil. "And I told him, 'Wait for me, Max. I have to go help Daddy, but I'm coming back. I promise I'm coming back. So you wait for me right here. Be a good boy and wait." Her voice broke completely, and she buried her face in Max's fur, her shoulders shaking with sobs. He remembered. All this time, through everything, he remembered. He came back to this spot, and he waited because I told him to, because he trusted me, because he believed I'd keep my promise. Thomas felt tears streaming down his own face, unchecked and unashamed. For Margaret, for Max, for Sarah, for every person and every creature that had ever loved something enough to wait, to hope, to believe in return, even when the world gave them every reason not to, for every promise kept and every faith rewarded and every reunion that seemed impossible but happened anyway. They sat there together for a long time, Sarah on the ground with Max in her arms, Thomas on the bench, the afternoon sun warming them all as the city moved around them, oblivious to the miracle that had just occurred. Eventually other people started to notice, started to stop and watch, drawn by Sarah's tears and Max's joy and the palpable sense that something important was happening here. An older man asked if everything was okay, and Sarah looked up at him with a smile that was luminous despite the tears. "I found him," she said simply. "I found my dog. He waited for me." Word seemed to spread. More people stopped. The elderly Eastern European woman who'd been bringing Max treats appeared, her face crumpling with joy when she saw the reunion. She said something in her native language that Thomas didn't understand, but the blessing in it was unmistakable. She crossed herself and touched Sarah's shoulder with her gnarled hand, and Sarah reached up to squeeze it, unable to speak, but conveying everything through that simple touch. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah finally composed herself enough to really look at Thomas. She studied him carefully, taking in his worn jacket, his tired eyes, the lines grief had carved into his face. "I don't even know your name," she said. "But you saved him. You kept him alive. You kept him going until I could get back." "Thomas," he said, "Thomas Brennan, and he did the same for me, if I'm being honest." Sarah studied him for a moment, seeing something in his face that made her expression soften with understanding. There was a recognition there, a silent acknowledgement that passed between two people who had both known profound loss. She didn't ask questions, didn't pry into wounds that were clearly still raw. She just nodded, accepting his words for the truth they carried. "My father died 3 weeks ago," she said quietly, one hand still stroking Max's head, the other wiping at her eyes. "Pancreatic cancer. From diagnosis to death was 5 months. 5 months of watching him disappear, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but pain and morphine and goodbyes that never felt adequate." Thomas's heart clenched. "I'm so sorry." "I've been wrapping up his affairs," Sarah continued, her voice distant. "Selling his house, going through 50 years of accumulated life, trying to figure out what to keep and what to let go, trying to figure out what comes next when your whole world has been turned upside down." She looked down at Max, and her expression crumbled again. "I came back today because I couldn't stay away anymore. I had to see this place one more time. I had to check, even though everyone told me it was pointless, that Max was long gone, that I was just torturing myself. I didn't let myself hope. I thought hoping was just another way to hurt myself. But some part of me needed to try, just one more time." "He never stopped waiting," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not for a single day. I've been coming here for months now, and he was always here, always in the same spot, always watching for you." Sarah's face crumpled, and she pulled Max closer, holding him like he was the most precious thing in the universe. which Thomas supposed he was, to her at least, the way Margaret had been to him. They talked for another hour, Sarah telling Thomas about her father, about the brutal reality of watching someone you love waste away, about the guilt and the grief and the terrible relief when it was finally over. Thomas found himself sharing his own story in return, about Margaret, about the cancer that had taken her, about the 42 years they'd had together and how it hadn't been nearly enough, about the emptiness of the apartment without her, the silence that felt like it would swallow him whole, the way every small thing reminded him of what he'd lost. "Does it get better?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "Everyone keeps telling me it will get better, that time heals, that eventually the grief won't feel so heavy. But I don't believe them. How can it get better when the person you love most in the world is gone?" Thomas considered his answer carefully. He didn't want to lie to her, didn't want to offer false comfort, but he also didn't want to take away her hope. "It doesn't get better," he said finally. "Not exactly, but it gets different. The grief doesn't go away, but you learn to carry it. Some days are harder than others. Some days you wake up and forget for a moment that they're gone, and then you remember and it feels like losing them all over again. But other days you can think about them without breaking apart. You can remember the good times without the pain overwhelming everything else." He looked at Max, at the way the dog was pressed against Sarah's side, content and complete, in a way he'd never been during all those months of waiting. "And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you find reasons to keep going. Small things at first, like making sure a lonely dog has food and water, like sitting with someone who understands waiting. But those small things add up. They create a life that's different from the one you had, but it's still a life. It's still worth living." Sarah wiped her eyes and offered him a watery smile. "Thank you for taking care of Max, for not giving up on him. I don't know how to repay you for that." "You don't need to repay me," Thomas said. "Taking care of Max, it saved me in a way, gave me a reason to get up in the morning when I didn't have any other reasons. So really, we're even." Sarah shifted, preparing to stand, and Max immediately stood with her, pressing against her leg, as if afraid she might disappear again. She picked up her backpack from where she'd dropped it, slinging it over her shoulder. "What will you do now?" she asked. Thomas hadn't thought about it. For months, his entire routine had centered around visiting Max, and now that routine was ending. The thought left him feeling unmoored, adrift. "I don't know," he admitted. "Go home, I suppose. Figure out what comes next." Sarah hesitated, biting her lip. "Would you, you don't have to, but would you want to visit sometime? To see Max? Check on him? You're part of his story now, part of our story. It doesn't feel right to just say goodbye and never see you again." Thomas felt something warm unfold in his chest. Not quite hope, not yet, but something close to it. A sense that maybe, just maybe, the world could still hold moments of connection, even after profound loss. "I'd like that," he said. "I'd like that very much." They exchanged phone numbers, Sarah's hands shaking slightly as she entered Thomas's information into her phone. She promised to text him once she got Max settled back at home, to send updates, to let Thomas know how the reunion was going. Max, for his part, seemed unable to decide whether to stay glued to Sarah's side or to return to Thomas for one more ear scratch, one more acknowledgement of the months they'd spent together. "It's okay, buddy," Thomas said, crouching down to Max's level one last time. He scratched behind the dog's ears, feeling the familiar softness of fur, the warmth of living flesh. "You can go home now. Your wait is over. You did it. You kept the faith and you were rewarded. Not everyone gets that. Not everyone's faith is answered, but yours was. So go home with Sarah and be happy. You deserve it." Max licked Thomas's hand, his tail wagging in broad, joyful sweeps, then returned to Sarah's side where he belonged. Thomas stood, his knees protesting slightly, and watched as Sarah clipped a leash onto Max's collar. A collar she'd been carrying in her backpack all this time, Thomas realized, just in case, even though she'd told herself not to hope. "Thank you, Thomas," Sarah said one more time, her voice breaking. "Thank you for believing in him when no one else did. Thank you for waiting with him." Thomas could only nod, his throat too tight for words. He watched them walk away together, Sarah's hand resting on Max's head, the dog's body pressed against her leg. They moved in perfect synchronization, two halves of a whole reunited at last, creating a picture of such complete belonging that it made Thomas's chest ache with bittersweet joy. When they turned the corner and disappeared from sight, Thomas stood alone at the bus stop for the first time in months. The bench where he'd spent countless hours seemed impossibly empty. The spot where Max had kept his vigil looked wrong, without the faithful dog sitting there. The whole world felt slightly off balance, as if something fundamental had shifted. But the silence felt different now, not suffocating, but peaceful, sacred even. This place had been witness to something rare and beautiful, a faith rewarded, a promise kept, a love that transcended time and circumstance. Max had waited, and his waiting had mattered. Sarah had returned, and her return had made all those long months of vigil worthwhile. Thomas felt Margaret's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder, and for the first time since her death, the feeling didn't bring only pain. There was comfort in it too, a sense of her approval, her love continuing beyond the boundaries of life and death. She would have loved this story. She would have cried and laughed and demanded to meet Max and Sarah. She would have said it was proof that love was stronger than loss, that waiting was never wasted, that faith, even when it seemed foolish, mattered. "I miss you," Thomas said to the empty air, to the ghost of his wife, to the universe that had taken her away. "Every single day, I miss you. But I think I'm going to be okay. Eventually. I think you'd want me to be okay." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of spring blossoms and new beginnings, and Thomas could have sworn he heard Margaret's laugh in it, that beautiful sound like wind chimes and summer rain. He pulled his phone from his pocket and opened the web browser, searching for local animal shelters. He wasn't ready yet, not quite, but soon. Soon he would be ready to open his heart again, to take in some creature that needed him as much as he needed it. Because that was what Max had taught him during those long months of waiting, that love didn't end when someone left. It transformed. It found new expressions, new channels, new ways to flow through the world. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, if you waited with faith and patience and an open heart, love found its way back to you in forms you never expected. Thomas walked to his car, feeling lighter than he had in months. The grief was still there. It would always be there. But it no longer felt like it was crushing him. He could breathe around it now. He could see past it to the possibility of something resembling hope. That night, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. It was a photo of Max, curled up on a couch, his head resting on Sarah's lap, both of them looking at the camera with expressions of pure contentment. The caption read, "Home at last. Thank you for everything, Thomas. You gave us both a second chance." Thomas stared at the photo for a long time, feeling tears prick his eyes, but they were good tears this time, tears of joy for a reunion he'd witnessed, for faith that had been rewarded, for love that had persisted through impossible circumstances. He texted back, "Thank you for coming back. Thank you for keeping your promise to him. You gave me a second chance too." The weeks that followed were strange. Thomas's routine had been so centered around visiting Max that he felt adrift without it. He'd wake up at the usual time, make his coffee, and start to get ready to drive to 14th Street before remembering that he didn't need to anymore. Max was home. Max was safe. Max was with the person he'd been waiting for. It should have felt like relief, like the completion of a task well done, and part of it did. But another part felt like loss, like another small death in a year that had already held too much dying. Thomas tried to fill the hours. He cleaned the apartment, finally boxing up some of Margaret's things that he hadn't been able to touch before. Not all of them. He wasn't ready for that. But some. Her old magazines, the expired medications in the bathroom cabinet, the get-well cards that had arrived during her illness and that he'd saved, even though she was no longer here to get well. He went through old photo albums, letting himself remember the good times without it destroying him completely. Margaret laughing at their wedding, her dress soaked from the rain. Margaret pregnant with their first child, her hand resting on her belly. Margaret on their 25th anniversary, silver threading through her dark hair, her eyes still bright with love. Margaret in the hospital, thin and pale but smiling because Thomas was there. He cooked meals for himself, simple things that Margaret used to make, her spaghetti recipe, her pot roast, her famous apple pie that their kids had always requested for birthdays. The kitchen felt less empty when it smelled like her cooking, even if she wasn't there to share it with him. And he thought about getting a dog. He researched breeds, read about adoption versus buying from a breeder, watched videos about dog training and care. He made lists of supplies he'd need, food bowls, a leash, a bed, toys. He thought about what kind of dog would fit his life now, his quieter existence, his smaller world. Sarah texted him regularly. Photos of Max, playing in the park, sleeping in patches of sunlight, greeting Sarah at the door when she came home from work. Updates about how he was adjusting, how he'd put on weight, how his coat was shinier now, how he seemed to have nightmares sometimes, but would calm down when Sarah held him. "He keeps looking at the door," Sarah texted one evening, "like he's making sure I'm really here, like he's checking that this isn't a dream." Thomas understood that feeling. In the weeks after Margaret's death, he'd wake up reaching for her, expecting to find her warm body beside him, only to encounter cold sheets and crushing disappointment. Reality kept asserting itself in cruel ways, reminding him over and over that she was gone, that this wasn't a nightmare he could wake up from. "Give him time," Thomas texted back. "He's been waiting so long it'll take a while for him to believe the wait is really over, but he'll get there. You both will." 3 months after Max's reunion with Sarah, Thomas finally made the decision. He drove to the city animal shelter, the same one where Sarah had found Max all those years ago, and walked through the rows of kennels, looking at the dogs that barked and jumped and pressed their noses through the chain link, desperate for attention, for love, for someone to choose them. He passed the puppies, adorable balls of energy that would have homes within days, and headed toward the back, where the older dogs were kept, the ones that had been there too long, the ones that people overlooked in favor of younger, cuter options. And there, in the last kennel on the left, he found her. She was older, maybe 8 or 9, with graying fur around her muzzle and kind, tired eyes. A golden retriever mix, the sign on her kennel said. Her name was Daisy. She'd been surrendered by her previous owners who were moving and couldn't take her with them. She'd been at the shelter for 4 months, watching potential adopters walk past her kennel day after day, choosing other dogs, younger dogs, leaving her behind. When Thomas stopped in front of her kennel, Daisy didn't jump or bark or put on a show like the other dogs. She simply stood up slowly, arthritis in her hips, Thomas could tell, walked over to the chain link and looked at him with eyes that held a depth of understanding that took his breath away. She knew. Somehow, she knew what it felt like to be left behind, to wait and hope and be disappointed over and over again. She knew about loss and loneliness, and the fear that no one would ever choose you again. "Hey there, beautiful girl," Thomas said softly, crouching down to her level. He reached his fingers through the chain link, and Daisy gently licked them, her tail wagging slowly, carefully, as if she'd learned not to hope too much. Thomas felt something crack open in his chest. "You've been waiting too, haven't you?" he whispered. "Waiting for someone to see you, to choose you, to take you home." A shelter volunteer approached, a young woman with a kind smile. "That's Daisy. She's a sweet old girl, very gentle, good with kids and other dogs. House-trained, knows basic commands. She's just—" The volunteer trailed off, searching for the right words. "Old," Thomas finished for her. "She's old, and nobody wants an old dog when they could have a puppy." The volunteer nodded sadly. "Exactly, but she has so much love to give. She just needs someone to give her a chance." Thomas looked at Daisy, at her graying muzzle and patient eyes, and thought about Max waiting at the bus stop for 8 months. He thought about the faith it took to keep believing when every day brought disappointment. He thought about Margaret, about how she'd stayed vibrant and full of life even as the cancer ate away at her body, how she'd made every moment count even when she knew her time was limited. "How long does she have?" Thomas asked. "I mean, realistically, what's her life expectancy?" The volunteer hesitated. "It's hard to say, maybe 5 years, maybe less. She has some health issues, the arthritis, a heart murmur. She'll need medication, regular vet visits. She's not a long-term investment if that's what you're looking for." Thomas smiled, feeling tears prick his eyes. "I'm not looking for an investment. I'm looking for someone to love, and I think I just found her." The volunteer's face lit up. "Really? You want to adopt her?" "Really," Thomas said, "if she'll have me." The paperwork took an hour. They asked him questions about his living situation, his experience with dogs, his ability to provide medical care. Thomas answered honestly, explaining that he'd never owned a dog before, but had spent months caring for a stray at a bus stop, learning what dogs needed, learning how to be patient and present and faithful. When all the forms were signed and the adoption fee paid, the volunteer brought Daisy out on a leash. The dog walked slowly but with dignity, her tail wagging in gentle sweeps. When she saw Thomas waiting for her, something shifted in her expression. Recognition maybe, or hope, or the beginning of trust. "Come on, girl," Thomas said, taking the leash. "Let's go home." The ride back to the apartment was quiet. Daisy sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window with an expression Thomas couldn't quite read. Was she scared, hopeful, confused about this sudden change in her circumstances? He reached over and gently scratched behind her ears, and she leaned into his touch with a small sigh that sounded like relief. At the apartment, Thomas had already prepared. He'd bought a dog bed, orthopedic, recommended for older dogs with joint issues, and placed it in the living room where Daisy could see him no matter which room he was in. He'd bought food and water bowls, high-quality senior dog food, toys that were soft and easy on aging teeth. He'd even bought a ramp to help her get up and down from the couch if she wanted to sit with him. Daisy explored the apartment slowly, sniffing everything, learning the layout, claiming the space as her own. She found the bed Thomas had prepared and circled it once before lying down with a soft grunt. She looked up at Thomas as if asking permission, and he smiled. "It's yours, girl. This is your home now. You don't have to wait anymore. You don't have to wonder if someone's coming back for you. I'm here, and I'm staying." That night, Thomas lay in bed with Daisy curled up on the dog bed beside him. He could hear her breathing, slow and steady, occasionally interrupted by small dream whimpers. He thought about Max, about Sarah, about faith rewarded and promises kept. He thought about Margaret, about the life they'd shared and the love that persisted even after death. And he thought about Daisy, this patient old soul who'd been waiting at the shelter for someone to choose her, someone to see past her age and her limitations to the love she still had to give. "Thank you," Thomas whispered into the darkness. He wasn't sure who he was talking to, Margaret maybe, or the universe, or Daisy herself. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to start again." The days settled into a new rhythm. Thomas would wake up to Daisy's gentle nose, nudging his hand, telling him it was time for breakfast and a morning walk. They'd walk slowly through the neighborhood, Daisy setting the pace, stopping to sniff interesting scents, and greet other dogs with dignified friendliness. Thomas found he enjoyed these walks, enjoyed the way they forced him out of the apartment, out of his own head, into the world of small pleasures, sunshine on his face, fresh air in his lungs, the simple joy of a dog's companionship. He'd make breakfast for both of them, scrambled eggs that they'd share, because Daisy loved eggs, and Thomas loved having someone to cook for again. They'd spend quiet mornings together, Thomas reading the newspaper while Daisy dozed in a patch of sunlight, both of them content in each other's presence. Sarah came to visit a month after Thomas adopted Daisy, bringing Max with her. The reunion was beautiful. Max and Daisy sniffed each other carefully, then seemed to recognize something kindred in each other. They'd both waited. They'd both been chosen. They'd both found their way home. They spent the afternoon playing gently in Thomas's small backyard, while Thomas and Sarah sat on the porch and talked about life and loss and the unexpected ways healing could find you. "He's doing so well," Sarah said, watching Max chase a ball that Daisy had politely declined to fetch. "He still has moments where he seems anxious, where he follows me from room to room like he's afraid I'll disappear. But they're getting less frequent. I think he's finally starting to believe that I'm really here to stay." Thomas nodded. "Daisy's the same way. Sometimes she'll wake up from a nap and look around frantically until she sees me. It's like she's checking that this is real, that she's really been adopted, that she's really home." "Trauma," Sarah said softly. "That's what the vet called it. Separation trauma. It leaves scars, even when the separation ends. Even when the reunion happens, the waiting changes you." Update, Thomas understood that intimately. The months he'd spent waiting for Margaret to get better, hoping against hope that the treatments would work, that they'd have more time. Those months had changed him fundamentally. He wasn't the same person he'd been before her diagnosis. Grief and loss had reshaped him, carved new hollows in his chest, taught him things about pain and endurance that he'd never wanted to know. But the waiting had taught him other things too. Patience, presence, the value of small moments, the importance of showing up day after day, even when there was no promise of a happy ending. "Max taught me something important," Thomas said, watching the two dogs play. "He taught me that waiting isn't passive. It's not giving up or standing still. It's actively choosing to believe, to hope, to keep faith, even when everything tells you not to. That's brave. That takes courage." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "You taught me something too. You showed me that even when you lose the person you love most in the world, even when it feels like your life is over, there are still reasons to keep going, still connections to be made, still love to give and receive." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Max and Daisy, watching the way Max would slow down when he noticed Daisy getting tired, the way Daisy would rest while Max ran circles around her, both of them content in their differences, accepting of each other's limitations. "My dad would have loved this," Sarah said eventually. "He always said that dogs were better than people at the important things: loyalty, forgiveness, unconditional love. He said if humans could learn to love the way dogs do, the world would be a better place." "Margaret said something similar," Thomas replied. "She said dogs were proof that pure goodness existed in the world, that they reminded us what we could be if we tried hard enough." The afternoon stretched into evening, and eventually Sarah and Max had to leave. The two dogs said goodbye with gentle nose touches, and Sarah promised to visit again soon. As Thomas watched them drive away, Daisy pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. "We're lucky, aren't we, girl?" Thomas said, scratching behind her ears. "We found each other. We both stopped waiting for what we'd lost and started building something new." Daisy's tail wagged slowly, and Thomas took that as agreement. The seasons changed. Summer arrived hot and bright, and Thomas bought a small plastic pool for the backyard where Daisy could cool off. She'd stand in it up to her belly, panting happily, and Thomas would laugh, actually laugh at her obvious pleasure. It was the first time he'd laughed since Margaret died, and it felt strange and wonderful and slightly guilty all at once. Fall came, painting the trees in brilliant colors. Thomas would rake leaves into piles, and Daisy would nose through them, sending them scattering, forcing Thomas to rake them again. He found he didn't mind. He found he enjoyed the simple, repetitive task, the way it gave his hands something to do, his mind something to focus on besides grief. Winter returned, but this time Thomas wasn't alone. He had Daisy curled up beside him on the couch, her warmth a comfort on cold nights. He had Sarah's regular texts and occasional visits. He had a reason to get up in the morning, a purpose beyond simple survival. 1 year after Margaret's death, Thomas visited her grave with Daisy. He brought flowers, Margaret's favorite, white lilies, and told her about everything that had happened, about Max and Sarah, about the months he'd spent sitting at a bus stop, keeping vigil with a faithful dog, about Daisy, about how opening his heart to this gentle old soul had saved his life in ways he couldn't fully express. "Thank you," he said to the headstone, to her memory, to the love they'd shared. "Thank you for loving me the way you did, for teaching me what it means to be faithful, for showing me how to wait with grace and hope. I carry you with me every day. You made me the person I am, and that person is finally learning how to live again." A robin landed on top of the headstone, the same type of bird that had appeared at Margaret's grave a year ago. Or maybe Thomas just wanted it to be the same bird, wanted it to be a sign. It cocked its head at Thomas, chirped once in a way that sounded almost like approval, then flew away into the clear blue sky. Daisy leaned against Thomas's leg, her weight solid and reassuring, and Thomas felt Margaret's presence like a warm blanket wrapped around his shoulders. She wasn't gone. Not really. She lived in his memories, in the lessons she'd taught him, in the way he tried to live his life with the same grace and courage she'd shown even in her darkest hours. "Come on, girl," Thomas said to Daisy. "Let's go home." And they did, together. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect. Grief was a companion that never fully left, and Thomas still had days when the missing felt like it would swallow him whole, but good, rich with meaning, filled with purpose. Thomas volunteered at the animal shelter where he'd found Daisy, helping to care for the forgotten dogs, the old ones, the sick ones, the ones that needed someone to believe in them when nobody else would. He became known as the man who adopted the unadoptable. When Daisy passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 14, having spent 5 good years with Thomas, 5 years of love and comfort and being chosen, he grieved deeply, but without the devastating emptiness that had consumed him after Margaret's death. He had learned that love was worth the pain of loss, that opening your heart, even knowing it would one day break again, was the bravest thing a person could do. Within a month, he adopted another senior dog, a 12-year-old beagle mix named Cooper, who'd been at the shelter for over a year, overlooked because of his age and his tendency to howl at night. Thomas didn't mind the howling. He understood the need to vocalize pain, to let the world know you were hurting. He'd done plenty of howling himself, in his own way. When Cooper passed 2 years later, Thomas adopted Bella, a 10-year-old pit bull mix that people crossed the street to avoid. She was the gentlest soul Thomas had ever met. All she wanted was to lean against him and be told she was a good girl, which Thomas did, every single day. The shelter staff started calling him Saint Thomas, but he would shake his head at that, uncomfortable with the designation. "I'm no saint," he'd say. "I'm just a man who learned about waiting from a very good dog. I'm just trying to pay forward the gift I was given." Sarah and Max remained part of his life. They'd visit regularly, and eventually Sarah started volunteering at the shelter too, inspired by Thomas's dedication. She'd bring Max with her, and the two of them would help socialize the dogs, showing nervous animals that humans could be trusted, that homes were possible, that waiting could end in joy. Little Margaret, Sarah's daughter, now 7 years old, loved coming to the shelter. She'd sit with the oldest dogs, the ones that had been waiting the longest, and read to them from her favorite books. Thomas watched her one afternoon, reading a picture book about a lost dog finding his way home to a grey, muzzled shepherd that had been at the shelter for 9 months, and felt his heart expand almost painfully in his chest. This was Margaret's legacy too, he realized. Not just the love she'd given him during their life together, but the love he was able to give now because of what she'd taught him. She'd shown him how to wait with grace, how to love without reservation, how to keep showing up even when showing up was the hardest thing in the world. And Max, faithful, patient Max, had reinforced those lessons, had shown Thomas that waiting was an act of faith, that loyalty mattered, that sometimes the impossible happened and prayers were answered, and reunions occurred against all odds. On quiet evenings, Thomas would sometimes walk past the bus stop on 14th Street. The shelter was long gone, replaced by a coffee shop with outdoor seating. But the bench was still there, and sometimes Thomas would sit on it and remember. He'd remember the rain-soaked dog with the patient eyes. He'd remember the months of companionship, of shared silence, of waiting together. He'd remember the miracle of Sarah's return, the joy of reunion, the proof that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, faith was rewarded. And he'd think about Margaret, about the way she'd waited for him every single day, about the way love persisted even after death, transforming into memory, into gratitude, into the determination to honor what you'd shared by living fully in the time you had left. One summer evening, when Thomas was in his 70s, Sarah visited him with little Margaret, now a bright, compassionate 12-year-old who'd announced her intention to become a veterinarian. Max had passed away 2 years earlier, at the grand old age of 15, surrounded by love and comfort. Sarah had grieved hard, but she'd also adopted again, a senior dog from the shelter, following Thomas's example, choosing an animal that desperately needed a home. Little Margaret sat on Thomas's porch with his current companion, a 13-year-old collie named Hope, gently brushing the dog's long fur, while Sarah and Thomas talked about life and time and all the changes they'd witnessed. "Do you ever think about that day?" Sarah asked. "The day we found each other at the bus stop?" "Every day," Thomas admitted. "It changed everything for me. Meeting Max, watching him wait, being there for your reunion, it gave me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What was that?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Purpose, I think, or maybe faith. The belief that love matters, that loyalty counts, that showing up makes a difference even when you can't see the results right away." Sarah nodded, understanding. "Max taught me the same thing. He showed me that true love doesn't give up. It waits. It believes. It holds on even when holding on seems impossible." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching young Margaret with hope, seeing the gentle care the girl showed the old dog, the way she spoke softly and moved slowly, respecting Hope's age and limitations. "She wants a dog of her own," Sarah said. "She's been asking for months. I told her when she turns 13, we'll go to the shelter together and she can choose." "Let me guess," Thomas said with a smile. "She'll choose the oldest one there, the one that's been waiting the longest." Sarah laughed. "Probably. She's been listening to your stories for years now. She believes in giving chances to the ones everyone else overlooks." Pride swelled in Thomas's chest. This, too, was part of the legacy. Not just the dogs he'd saved, but the lessons passed on to the next generation. The understanding that every creature deserved love, that age was no barrier to connection, that waiting and hoping and believing still mattered in a world that often felt cynical and cruel. Later that night, after Sarah and Margaret had gone home, Thomas sat on his porch with Hope at his feet, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. He thought about Max, about Margaret, about all the creatures and people who had taught him about love and loss and the grace of waiting. He thought about Daisy and Cooper and Bella and all the other dogs he'd loved and lost over the years, each one leaving paw prints on his heart, each one teaching him something new about living and letting go. And he thought about Hope, this patient old soul currently resting her greying muzzle on his foot, content simply to be in his presence. She wouldn't be with him much longer. Her health was failing, her time growing short, but that didn't make their bond less precious. If anything, it made every moment more valuable, every scratch behind the ears more meaningful, every quiet evening together a gift to be treasured. "Thank you," Thomas whispered into the gathering dark, to Hope, to all the dogs he'd known, to Margaret, to Max, to Sarah, to the universe that had brought them all together in unexpected ways. "Thank you for teaching me that waiting is not passive. It's not giving up. It's the opposite. It's holding on. It's believing. It's love in its purest form." Hope looked up at him with dark, patient eyes, eyes that reminded him of another dog in another time, and Thomas could have sworn he saw understanding there. Recognition. Agreement. They sat together as night fell completely, man and dog, waiting for nothing in particular and everything at once. Waiting for tomorrow, for love, for the next moment of grace that would remind them why patience, why faith, why waiting with an open heart was always worth it. The dog who waited had taught Thomas how to live again, And that, Thomas thought as stars filled the sky above him, was the greatest gift he'd ever received. Years later, when Thomas's own time came to an end, he died peacefully in his sleep with Hope curled up beside him, her presence a comfort until his very last breath. At his funeral, Sarah spoke about how her dog Max had led her to Thomas, how Thomas had been a grandfather to her daughter, a friend in her darkest times, a reminder that kindness could be found in unexpected places. She told the story of Max's 8-month vigil, of Thomas's faithful care, of the reunion that had seemed impossible, but happened anyway. She talked about how one dog's unwavering loyalty had created ripples of love that extended far beyond anything anyone could have imagined. "Thomas taught me that waiting isn't about the time that passes," Sarah said, her voice steady despite her tears, standing at the podium in front of friends, family, and dozens of shelter volunteers who had come to pay their respects. "It's about what you do with that time, how you show up, how you remain present, how you keep believing even when belief seems foolish." She paused, looking out at the assembled mourners, and her eyes landed on young Margaret, now a beautiful 18-year-old about to start veterinary school, sitting with her own rescue dog, a 15-year-old terrier mix named Charlie that she'd adopted on her 13th birthday, just as she'd promised. "He taught me that love doesn't end when someone leaves," Sarah continued. "It transforms. It finds new expressions, new channels, new ways to flow through the world." Thomas loved his wife Margaret with his whole heart, and when she died, that love didn't disappear. It became the love he showed to Max during those months at the bus stop. It became the love he showed to Daisy and Cooper and Bella and Hope and every senior dog he rescued over the years. It became the love he showed to me and my daughter, welcoming us into his life, becoming the grandfather we needed. Sarah's voice broke, and she had to pause to compose herself. Young Margaret stood and went to her mother, wrapping an arm around her waist in support. Together they finished the eulogy. "Thomas once told me that Max taught him waiting was an act of faith," Margaret said, her young voice clear and strong. "And I think that's the most important lesson we can take from his life. He had faith in love, in connection, in the power of showing up day after day, even when it's hard. He waited with Max. He waited with all those dogs at the shelter, believing that the right person would come for them. And he taught all of us to have that same faith." After the service, a stone was placed at Thomas's grave, right next to Margaret Brennan's. Nothing elaborate, just a simple marker with his name, his dates, and a single line that Sarah and young Margaret had chosen together. Thomas Brennan. He learned to wait, and in waiting, found life. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants gold across the cemetery, people swear they can see a brown and white dog sitting patiently beside the graves, keeping watch, keeping faith, waiting with the kind of love that transcends time and death and all the boundaries we think separate us from each other. The shelter that Thomas had volunteered at for so many years established the Thomas Brennan Senior Dog Fund in his memory. It provided medical care, food and support for older dogs that needed homes, ensuring that no senior dog would be overlooked because of age or health issues. Young Margaret became the fund's first major donor when she graduated from veterinary school, using her inheritance from Thomas to help continue his work. Sarah never stopped telling the story of Max and Thomas and that miraculous reunion at the bus stop. She wrote a book about it, a slim volume filled with photos and memories and lessons learned, and donated all the proceeds to the Senior Dog Fund. The book became a small sensation, touching hearts around the world, inspiring others to adopt senior pets, to keep faith when situations seemed hopeless, to believe in the power of waiting with love. People would write to Sarah from across the country, across the world, sharing their own stories of faithful dogs and miraculous reunions, of love that persisted through impossible circumstances. Each letter was a testament to the truth that Thomas had discovered, that waiting, when done with faith and presence and open-hearted belief, was never wasted. The bus stop on 14th Street became something of a pilgrimage site. People who'd read Sarah's book would visit, sitting on the same bench where Thomas had spent so many hours with Max, taking photos, leaving flowers, sharing their own stories of loss and hope, and the companions who'd helped them through dark times. The city eventually placed a small plaque on the bench, in memory of Max, who waited here with faith, and Thomas Brennan, who waited with him. Love is patient, love is kind, love waits. Years passed, decades. Young Margaret became doctor. Margaret Chen, a renowned veterinarian who specialized in geriatric animal care. She opened a clinic that offered sliding-scale services for senior pets, ensuring that lack of money would never force someone to give up an aging animal. She married a kind man who loved animals as much as she did, and they filled their home with rescue dogs, always the old ones, always the ones that had been waiting too long. Sarah grew older, her dark hair turning silver like her daughter's dog Charlie had been. She never remarried. Some loves, she said, were complete in themselves, and what she'd had with Max and then with Thomas's friendship had been enough to fill a lifetime. She continued volunteering at the shelter until her health no longer permitted it, and even then she fostered senior dogs in her home, giving them comfort and love in their final days. And the stories multiplied. A man in Seattle read Sarah's book and adopted a 12-year-old collie that had been at the shelter for 2 years. A woman in Boston, grieving the loss of her husband, found purpose in fostering elderly cats. A family in Texas started a senior pet sanctuary, directly inspired by Thomas's legacy. A teenager in London began a social media campaign highlighting overlooked older shelter animals, helping hundreds find homes. The ripples spread wider and wider, touching lives in ways Thomas never could have imagined during those cold months, sitting at a bus stop with a waiting dog. His simple act of kindness, bringing food and water to a stray, keeping vigil with a lonely creature, had sparked something that continued to grow long after he was gone. Because that's what love does. It multiplies, it spreads, it transforms the world in quiet, persistent ways. On the 20th anniversary of Max's reunion with Sarah, the city held a small ceremony at the bus stop. Dr. Margaret Chen was there, now in her 40s, with her own children, twin boys who'd been raised with a house full of elderly rescue dogs and who already talked about becoming veterinarians, like their mother. Sarah was there, elderly now but still vibrant, still telling stories about Max and Thomas to anyone who would listen. And there were others. Dozens of people whose lives had been touched by Thomas's example, by Max's faith, by Sarah's willingness to share their story. People holding photos of the senior dogs they'd adopted, the elderly cats they'd given homes to, the overlooked animals they'd chosen to love. The mayor spoke, honoring the legacy of one man and one dog and the power of their story to inspire change. A local artist unveiled a small bronze statue, a dog sitting in patient vigil, its gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting with eternal faith. It was placed near the bench, a permanent reminder of what had happened here, of what was possible when love refused to give up. Dr. Margaret Chen spoke last, her sons standing beside her, their hands resting on the heads of the 2 elderly dogs they'd brought with them. Rescues, of course, 13 and 14 years old, adopted just last month. "My mother tells me I'm named after Thomas's wife, Margaret Brennan," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the warm afternoon air. "A woman I never met, but who I feel I know through the love she inspired in Thomas. She taught him about faithfulness and presence and waiting with grace, and he passed those lessons on to all of us." She looked at the bronze statue, at the patient dog forever keeping its vigil. "We live in a world that values youth and newness and the next big thing. We're taught to move fast, to not look back, to cut our losses and move on. But Max and Thomas showed us something different. They showed us that waiting has value, that patience is powerful, that faith, even when it seems foolish, matters." She paused, her eyes scanning the crowd, landing on each face, making connections. "How many of us are here because of them? because their story touched something in us, reminded us that love is worth waiting for, worth working for, worth believing in, even when belief is hard. Hands raised throughout the crowd, nearly everyone. They'd all been changed by this story in some way. This is their legacy, Dr. Chen continued. Not just the Senior Dog Fund, not just the animals that have been saved, but the reminder that each of us has the power to wait with someone, to show up, to believe, to love without reservation or fear. Thomas waited with Max. Max waited for my mother, and in their waiting, they created something beautiful and lasting and true. She looked at her sons, at their dogs, at her mother standing nearby with tears streaming down her face. So let's honor them by continuing to wait, by continuing to show up for the creatures and people who need us, by continuing to believe that love, patient, faithful, enduring love, can change the world. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. 2 minutes of quiet reflection, of remembering, of honoring the dog who waited and the man who waited with him. And in that silence, something remarkable happened. A brown and white dog, stray by the looks of it, thin and scruffy, wandered up to the bronze statue. It sniffed the base, circled once, then sat down beside it, facing the street, assuming the same pose as the statue, the same pose Max had held for 8 long months. The crowd gasped. Someone laughed. Someone else cried. Sarah walked forward slowly, kneeling down beside the dog, extending her hand for it to sniff. "Hey there, sweetheart," she said softly. "Are you waiting for someone too?" The dog looked at her with dark, patient eyes that held depths of sadness and hope and longing. It had no collar, no tags, just like Max all those years ago. Sarah looked up at her daughter, at the crowd, at the bronze statue that seemed to be keeping vigil alongside this new, waiting dog, and she smiled through her tears. "I think," she said, her voice trembling with emotion and wonder, "that Thomas and Max are telling us their work isn't finished, that there are still dogs waiting, still stories to be told, still reasons to have faith." Dr. Chen came forward, kneeling beside her mother, examining the dog with professional eyes, malnourished but otherwise healthy, young, maybe 2 or 3 years old, frightened but not aggressive, waiting, just like Max had waited, for someone to claim it, to love it, to bring it home. "What do you think, Mom?" Dr. Chen asked. "One more?" Sarah looked at the dog, really looked at it, and saw Max in its eyes, saw Thomas's kindness, saw the long lineage of faithful creatures who had waited and loved and believed against all odds. "One more," she agreed. "There's always room for one more." She stood, a bit stiffly. Her joints weren't what they used to be, and called to the dog. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's get you some food and water. Let's get you checked out. And then, if you want, you can come home with me. You don't have to wait alone anymore." The dog stood, hesitated for just a moment, then followed Sarah toward her car. Dr. Chen walked alongside them, her sons trailing behind with their own elderly rescues, creating a small parade of hope and second chances and love that refused to quit. The crowd watched them go, and many were crying openly now, because they understood what they were witnessing, the story coming full circle, the legacy continuing, the lesson being taught again and again until everyone understood. Love waits. Love persists. Love transforms. Love saves. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, if you keep faith and stay present and believe even when believing seems impossible, love leads you exactly where you need to be. The bronze dog keeps its vigil still, there beside the bus stop on 14th Street. Rain or shine, summer heat or winter cold, it sits and waits with patient faith, and people passing by will stop sometimes, will touch its bronze head for luck, will whisper their own stories of waiting and hoping and loving. They'll tell their children about Max, the dog who waited 8 months for his person to return, about Thomas, the grieving widower who found purpose in caring for a waiting dog, about Sarah, who never gave up searching, who kept her promise, who came back. And they'll understand that this isn't just a story about one dog and one man and one miraculous reunion. It's a story about all of us, about every person who's ever waited for love, for healing, for hope, about every creature who's ever kept faith when faith seemed foolish, about every heart that's chosen to remain open even after being broken. The dog who waited taught us something essential, that waiting, when done with love and faith and presence, is not passive. It's the most active thing in the world. It's a choice made every single day, to believe, to hope, to remain, to trust that what matters most is worth waiting for. And in the end, isn't that what life is? One long act of faith, of waiting for the moments that make everything else worthwhile. We wait for love to find us, for healing to come, for meaning to emerge from suffering, for reunion with those we've lost, whether in this life or whatever comes after. We are all, in our own ways, dogs at bus stops, keeping vigil, holding faith, waiting with patient hearts for the things and people and moments that give our lives meaning. And the lesson, the beautiful, terrible, wonderful lesson that Max and Thomas and Sarah taught the world, is that the waiting is never wasted. Every moment of faith matters. Every act of presence counts. Every choice to keep loving, keep hoping, keep believing makes a difference. Because love is patient, love is kind, love waits, and sometimes, against all odds, against all reason, despite every disappointment and heartbreak, love is rewarded. The end. In loving memory of every faithful dog who ever waited, and every kind soul who waited with them.